Ghost, the Bootlegger's Horse by Sarah Sparks. Trail lifted one of Ghost's heavy hooves to check the shoe. It was only a loose nail and easily fixed. He lowered the hoof gently, stood up and gave Ghost a friendly pat on the rump. "We'll get that seen to, my lad." Ghost swung his head around and nuzzled Trail's leg. Ghost was a dapple-gray giant, and he loved Trail. He hoped that Trail might have a carrot or an apple in his pocket for him to find. Trail laughed as Ghost nudged his overalls. "No, I didn't forget." Ghost munched the apple thoughtfully. His large brown eyes followed Trail around as he cleared out the stall and got the harness ready. He wondered, as a horse wonders, in horse thoughts, in horse ways, what they were getting ready for. Plowing? Hauling trees? A trip to town? Ghost was just a wee foal when he came to Trail's family farm years ago, and they had grown up together. Thin and long-legged, he grew large and strong. Ghost had had his tail bobbed long ago, as was the fashion for a cart horse, so it wouldn't catch up in the plow. This had greatly concerned Trail, and he didn't believe his papa when he tried to soothe him, explaining that it probably hadn't hurt because Ghost would have been so very young when it was done. "I'll bet you Ghost would say different," Trail had cried. If Ghost could speak, he would have said different. He'd also tell how hard it was to switch flies. When he wasn't working, Ghost was free to roam in a grassy paddock where he observed life going on around him. The chickens scratching, the sheltered cabin with clothes on the line, Hetty trying to get the goats, shan't and won't, out of the garden. "You vex me terrible," she would shout, waving her hat at them with no results. Hetty's face wore a constant smile. She was thin and wiry from working the homestead alongside her husband, and there was not much meat on her bones, as they say. Some might call Trail handsome. Certainly Hetty would. He was tall, and like Hetty, his face was lined from laughter. An old floppy-brimmed hat he had for years kept the sun out of his eyes. His clothes were worn, patched in a few places, but clean. They didn't have a lot to spend on being fancy, as Hetty put it. Trail and Hetty had no children, and this seemed to have opened their hearts to include everything and everyone as family. They were known as kind and generous people, whose kindness reached out to everyone and everything. The birds, the chickens, the ornery rooster, even the two goats. But their favorite was Ghost. Trail and Hetty loved Ghost like a child. They had a nice little spot here in the hills. It was clean and cheerful. The roof and cabin were kept in good repair, and they both worked the garden. Hetty sometimes bartered jams, jellies, and knitted goods at Harvard's. They managed as best they could, but Trail always had hope for something better for them. Fortunately, they had the side business, and it had been very good to them. Sometimes Trail thought, "Too bad it's illegal," and then immediately corrected himself with, "Good thing it is." When Trail harnessed up Ghost to go down in the valley to Grenville, he sometimes added bags of sugar, yeast, and copper line to the list of items they needed. These are for the side business. Hetty and Trail were independent, resourceful people, but if they couldn't make it, hunt it, or grow it, a trip to Harvard's general store in town was in order. This was what Ghost was thinking as he was being hitched to the wagon. Trail wiped the sleep from his eyes as he put on the leather collar and buckled the leather straps around Ghost's enormous girth. He gently slipped the bit into Ghost's mouth and the bridle over his ears, then paused for a minute, enjoying the spring breeze, and looked down into the valley below. Through the trees, he can see the lone farms that dot the pasture lands and further off the town of Grenville. Hetty was taking the laundry in when she called out, "Wait on a minute, I've got something for Buttons and cake." She disappeared into the cabin and returned with a hamper she'd filled with freshly baked biscuits and some blackberry jam. Trail smiled as he took the hamper and put it in the wagon beside him. "Don't get into that on your way." "Can't guarantee that, Hetty," he called back over his shoulder as he and Ghost started down the road that snaked along the ridges to their nearest neighbors. It wasn't much of a road, and if a person didn't know their way around, they could easily get lost. Hidden trails, nothing more than wheel ruts, connect the various people that live remotely in these hills. These come in handy if someone wanted to move around without anyone knowing. Even the main road that came up from the valley seemed to disappear the farther up it went. People didn't come up very far into the hills anyway, unless there was a very good reason. Cake and Buttons lived about halfway down the hill to town. Cake was a blacksmith and made and repaired harness. As his name implied, he enjoyed tasty treats and had earned the nickname Cake Boss from winning a cake-eating contest at the local fair. Cake stuck until it was like he was called Tom or Joe. He always appreciated the goodies that Hetty sent. Trail often stopped in to see if he could get Cake and Buttons anything on his trip or pick up any repair that had been left at Harvard's. They didn't get into town all that frequently, so having Trail help out with that was very appreciated. Easygoing and good-natured, Cake was a casual kind of fellow who joked around and keeps Buttons laughing so she wouldn't worry so much. She worried because keeping an eye on all of her family was a full-time job, and she knew that the hills had any number of places that an accident could happen, not to mention the bears, cougars, and coyotes. "They'll be fine," Cake would say as he waved his hand. But the warm bearskin blanket on the bed was a reminder of what an accurate shot Buttons was. Cake and Buttons have a half a dozen children, and as Trail and Ghost pulled into their lane, they came running over laughing to see them. Cake walked down the lane and waved. "Good to see you, Trail. How's everything with you and Hetty?" "Just fine, Cake. She made you some biscuits and jam. I tell you, it was hard not to dip into them myself." Trail handed the basket over to Cake as he got down. "Oh, don't those look tasty? I know what we'll be having for lunch. You on your way to town?" "Yes, I am, but I wondered if you might see to Ghost's shoe. Looks like it's loose and probably just needs a nail or two." "I'll see to that right away." He unhitched Ghost from the wagon and led him down over to a small shed by the house and checked his hooves. "Yep, that's it. Won't take me but a minute. Go on inside. Buttons is just finishing up the chores." Buttons came out of the cabin and greeted Trail with a smile. The children were hanging on to Trail and hopping up and down the steps. "You got quite a brood there, Buttons." "Indeed I do, Trail. You need a young'un. Why not take a few of mine?" she laughed. "You got time for a cup of coffee?" "That'd be fine, Buttons. I'll just take it here on the porch if you don't mind. It's such a nice day." Buttons went inside. Cake had finished with Ghost and was leading him over. The young'uns all loved good-natured Ghost. Trail put two of them on Ghost's back, and Ghost ambled about as they laughed. He never worried that Ghost might shy or step on any of them. Ghost just seemed to know to be gentle with children. Buttons had brought out coffee for all of them, so they sat on the steps and relaxed, chatting about the weather and the news since they last met. Cake gave Trail a bridle and a collar to take back to Harvard's. "Have you seen anything of Kip lately? He's a bit of a lone wolf," asked Cake. "Not seen hide nor hair of him," Trail responded, "and probably not likely to. You know how Hetty feels about him." Hetty had no use at all for Kip and rolled her eyes whenever his name came up. Once, when Cake suggested that Kip was just unlucky, Hetty snapped at him with, "Oh, poor me, Kip. If luck came gift-wrapped at Christmas, he'd turn his nose up at it 'cause he'd asked for something different. He's been hard done by since birth. First words his ma heard was, 'Tain't fair.' Don't get me going on Kip." Trail had tried to soften her mood a bit. "He's just lonely." Hetty had shot him a look. Small wonder. Who'd put up with him? Truth be told, Kip was lonely, and Trail had no good answer to her question. Kip would have been handsome if not for his brooding temperament. He had dark eyes and high cheekbones, and wore his long, straight black hair as one braid down his back. However, unlike Cake and Trail, he had no laugh lines in his face. His mouth was usually set in a hard line that seldom softened, He lived a few miles away on the back roads. No one dropped in to see Kip. Kip complained about everything. The expression, "the glass is half empty," was Kip to a T. Nothing worked right. No one treated him well enough, and he never got his due. "It's not fair," truly was all you heard. How long can anyone listen to that? As a consequence, Kip had no friends, no luck, and nothing worked. Keeping on the sunny side was someone else's job, it seemed, not his. Rolled into "it's not fair" was a heaping spoonful of jealousy for those who, in Kip's mind, had it all given to them on a platter. Trail came under this heading. Those days, times were hard. If you lived in the countryside, you could have a garden, maybe hunt a bit, and that made it easier. But money was tight and life was an uphill grind for most folks. There was also a law passed that said drinking of a certain beverage was no longer legal. This beverage often lightened the load of the weary, brightened the eye at a country dance, and gave laughter around the table with friends. Didn't seem fair, really, but that was the law. This law was called prohibition, and people who made it felt that certain beverages could make a person ornery or unpleasant to be around when they drank too much of them. Trail knew that to be true for himself and never touched the bitter spirits anymore. "Doesn't improve me," he'd say. But Trail was a businessman at heart, and he knew that a little extra could be made with a side business. It provided a commodity which was in much demand. Trail felt he provided a trusted and important service for the area, and he was proud of his product. People liked what he delivered and thought his prices were fair. Hetty and Trail were very careful with the money they'd saved and hidden away, and very cautious about revealing any information about the side business. It wasn't lost on Kate that Kip had it in for Trail, and that morning, as Trail was getting ready to leave, he warned him about it. "Watch out for Kip, Trail, 'cause you got something he wants, and he wants it bad." Trail just laughed. "He can want all he likes. Nothing he can do anything about." "Well, I'm just saying I got a bad feeling, and you know how sometimes my gut feelings are right." What Kip wanted was the side business, and Trail had no way of knowing Kip was already busy planning to get it. Now, Kip had his own side business, but because of his general disposition and the dark cloud always over his head, no one really wanted to do much business with him. He was gruff and rude, often showing up complaining he'd been short-changed, so his route of delivery was small in comparison to Trail's. Kip also dipped into his own product from time to time, making him more disagreeable than ever. It was a vicious circle, and Kip seemed to have invested a lot of time in its making. He lived alone in a rough cabin, and lived sparingly, mostly hunting for his food and buying tin goods in town. His one stroke of luck was the beautiful black horse that pulled his wagon, that he called Black Diamond. Even Kip thought it hardly possible that someone like him could have a horse like that. Black Diamond had once been a carriage horse, but when times got hard, his family had to part with him. He'd been sent to auction where Kip had bid on him and got him for a song. Kip wasn't unkind to him, but Diamond missed his old home, where a little girl had brought him carrots and apples. He had a clean, airy stall and a groom who curried him daily. His harness was patent leather, and heads turned when he was taken out about town. Sadly, those days were long gone. Here, his harness was old and didn't fit properly. His stall was rough and draughty. There were few treats, and Kip didn't always get the burdocks out of his mane and tail. There was no coddling with Kip Allison. Kip brewed a decent product and had his own customers, but because of his ornery nature, they were further off and harder to get to. Trail had the best routes. He didn't think that was fair. It just made him so angry that Trail and Hetty had it so easy when he had it so hard. When he was sitting alone brooding in his cabin, he often pondered what might be done to remedy that situation. Kip had made it his mission to keep his eyes and ear open to Trail's comings and goings. It had been a long, cold winter that year, and spring had brought the promise of new life and hope for a better time, for most people, but not for Kip. Kip had spent the time in a foul temper. When the weather was cold, the wind and ice made his mood even darker. More sure than ever, it was all so unfair that others should have so much and he should have so little. He nursed a great big grudge against Trail. During the winter, he hatched a plan. A good plan, and it made him feel very much warmer just having it simmer in his mind until spring. Winter was letting go. The warmth of the sun was stronger, and the days got longer. Just as the sun was coming up and he had finished having coffee, Kip decided today was the day to put the plan into action. He harnessed up Black Diamond and started down the winding trail from his place. He took the road going past the farms in the valley until it became the main street of Grenville. He passed Harvard's store and headed out of town. They had been traveling for a couple of hours when Kip pulled Black Diamond over at a small creek by the side of the road to give him a drink. He rolled up his sleeves and splashed cool water on his face. The sun was up high in the sky. Must be nearly noon, thought Kip. He got back in the wagon and ate the slice of bread with butter and brown sugar he'd brought with him and contemplated his plan and what he would say. Satisfied this was to unfold as anticipated, he clucked up Diamond. Up now, lad, not much longer. After a bit, they met more wagons and sometimes motor cars. The houses got bigger and closer together. The sidewalks were tree-lined and big brick buildings appeared. Instead of treading on the soft dirt road, Diamond's iron shoes now clattered on cobblestone streets. Kip walked Diamond along the street. They passed busy shops with men and ladies' hats, a tobacco store, a pharmacy, and a doctor's office. He saw the window he'd hoped for. It had a big star in gold and sheriff's office written over the top. Finally, said Kip, this is where I'm going to have a little chat with some important people. People with suits and badges, the kind who might be interested in some fellow who makes deliveries when the moon is dark and people are thirsty. Whoa up, he said. Diamond stopped. Kip straightened his hat and got down from the wagon. As he did, he caught sight of himself in the window. He was tall and lean and rough, his long oilskin coat giving him a certain flair, but his gloves were worn, as were his boots. He hesitated before going up the steps. Part of him knew this was not the right thing to do, but another part of him whispered, "Ain't fair." So he marched up the steps and through the door. The young man at the desk eyed him up and down. "Yes, sir. Can I help you?" "I want to talk with who's in charge," said Kip, pulling himself up and squaring his shoulders. "About?" "About some stuff. Stuff that ain't right. Ain't, legal." Kip mumbled the last bit as he felt somewhat a bit ashamed of himself. 1 minute. The young man disappeared down a back hall, and when he returned, he motioned Kip to come back with him and opened the door to an office. There was a large desk covered with papers, and beside the desk sat Chief Officer Halford Ignatius Edwards. Hal was a handsome man, slim, well-dressed, his hair cut in the style of the day. He wore it slicked back and shiny with pomade. A pink carnation often adorned his lapel. The gold of his cufflinks glinted. His shirt was white starched and clean. A fine silk tie completed the look. "You know a man by the cut of his cloth," Hal would remark as he studied himself in the mirror. Hal loved cologne and wore a lot of it. A lot of it. With the cloying scent of lavender and roses. Although those he worked with found it terribly offensive, no one dared say anything. He could be intimidating when he chose. Hal nodded towards the chair in front. Kip took off his hat and awkwardly sat down. He glanced around the room at the books that lined the walls and glanced at Hal's face, which gave no hint of the interest in why Kip might be there. Kip cleared his throat, hinting at the importance of what he was about to reveal. He lowered his voice and hoped he sounded serious. "I got something you're going to want to hear." There was a long silence, and Hal leaned back, crossed his legs, and sighed. "Well, sir, let's hear it then." Kip nervously began to tell him about Trail's side business. A tiny bit of conscience made him squirm a bit in his seat, but he managed to bury that annoying feeling. He was just about to give all the details of when and where Trail would be when he had a thought. There was no point in giving it all away for nothing. "You know, I come a long way to tell you this. Cost me some, and hard on the horse." Hal nodded obligingly and assured him there would be something for his trouble. Kip took that as a sign to proceed and supplied the routes, the night, and the time Trail would be setting out. When he finished, Kip let out his breath and sat back a bit expectantly, thinking perhaps there might be a word of praise for doing his duty as a good citizen. Hal was quiet as he wrote an amount on a piece of paper. He handed it to Kip and nodded towards the clerk's desk. "They'll take care of it." Kip stood up a bit shamefaced, got the money, and hurried out into the street to the wagon. He folded the bills up in his pocket. Chicken feed. He thought he deserved more reward, more gratitude, more time, more respect. He was grateful for the fresh air, though. Hal's cologne had given him a headache. "It's not fair," he mumbled. "Gee up, Diamond." He turned the horse around and headed back home. Once out on the road, Kip regained more of his swagger, his original sense of self-righteous importance. He was confident now he had done right and would have sunshine and rainbows from now on. It was only a matter of time. All would be going his way. Hal Edwards knew Kip Allison's type. This information wasn't coming from the goodness of his heart, if you could find it. He commented after Kip lumbered out of his office, muddy boots scuffing the floor and banging the door behind him. Hal didn't really like his job. When he first entered the force, he thought he'd be chasing down evildoers and righting all the wrongs of the world. But as time passed, it seemed most of the evildoers were just folks who had hit a rough patch and made the great mistake of simply getting caught. From where he stood, it appeared the scales of justice were weighed in the favor of those that had, and hit hard those that didn't. As a lad, he'd had a small job at a hotel. He'd helped people with their luggage and stabled their horses. He genuinely liked talking with people and learning about where they'd come from and where they were going. Hal had come from a decent family, but his father was a working man and money was tight. Hal often contemplated what he might have done if there had been the resources available. He imagined himself the owner of a prosperous hotel with influential and important patrons. He'd drive around in a fancy buggy with a flashy horse. People would tip their hats to him as they trotted by. He'd be a gentleman. He wouldn't be a cop dealing with the riffraff of society. Bootleggers, for instance. He sighed, lit a cigarette, and watched from the window while Kip and Black Diamond disappeared behind the traffic of people, carriages, and cars that rattled past. "Geez," he mused, "where'd a guy like him get a horse like that?" Tag. Later that week, after Kip's little visit to the station, Hal was sitting at his desk looking at the bright spring day outside. He put out his cigarette, put on his hat and coat, approved the look in the mirror, and told the front office that he was going to investigate some criminal activity. He often took advantage of jaunts in the line of duty. It got him out of the stuffy office and the mundane round of booking the unfortunates who couldn't raise bail.